Okay,
here we go. Welcome to the God21 podcast. My colleague Jay Akkerman and I want to welcome you to another edition of God21 podcast, exploring some great ideas with some great thinkers. And today's podcast is unusual. I guess they're all unusual. We always pick great topics.
we're consistent in being unusual.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to talk about two things that are probably rarely ever thought about together: the brain and preaching.
And that was one of the reasons why I was really intrigued by this book, Tom. A friend of mine referred me to it not too long ago, and I actually adopted it as a text in a course I'm teaching right now online. And the book by Richard Cox titled Rewiring Your Preaching, How the Brain Processes Sermons.
You know, there's a lot of exciting things going on in neuroscience. Some people like to say that the hubbub over the creation evolution stuff continues on, but it's not nearly as hot as it used to be. The arguments about Big Bang Theory and, you know, how things started are still going on, but they're not as hot as they used to be. But the really hot stuff right now in science and theology is in the neuroscience area. The kind of stuff they're doing in terms of looking at what parts of the brain influence what things, and how people who have damaged sections of the brain aren't able to do, aren't able to empathize, aren't able to do other kinds of things we normally think everyone should be able to do. And then I think some of the most exciting stuff is the way that research is suggesting that your brains really change over time. Not only change in terms of, what they're going to do genetically and growth as you mature, but change in the sense that the environment, the things you learn, hear, and your own intentional activities can actually rewire and restructure your neural networks.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. No longer is the brain is sort of a static computer, but it's more like an organism that actually changes. And I think that has huge implications for how we think about not only the knowledge we get from hearing sermons, but the way we relate to others in an environment and the kind of environment we live in.
One of the things that I have dared pastors and preachers to do over the past decade, I don't know if I've ever had anybody take me up on it. If you're listening to this and you give it a try, feel free to shoot me an email here. But I've dared preachers to set up a video camera in the front of their church, hide it in a plant or something like that, put a little piece of electrical tape over the little red dot or whatever so it doesn't draw attention to anything, and then just videotape your congregation while you're preaching.
Oh, I don't know if that's a good idea at all.
And then when you're having a really good day, you don't do this on Monday morning, but when you're having a really good day and you really want to sit down and really take a look at what's happening while you're up there preaching. And I think that what's kind of behind my challenge really was resident in Dr. Richard Cox's mind as he was writing this book. Because all of us who have stood in a pulpit, if we're honest with ourselves, I hope somewhere along the way we're also asking ourselves, I sure hope I'm connecting. And like our brains, hopefully as preachers, we're adjusting and doing whatever we can to try to engage that congregation, small or large, to not just smile and shake our hands at the end and say they liked our sermon, but actually be motivated to do something different toward an outcome that, with the Spirit's help, really can make an eternal difference.
Yeah, I've often thought about what seems to be a lack of change that comes about because of a sermon. And, thought, well, is there something else we could do at that time during worship service? But our author, Richard Cox, recognizes that people aren't always tuned in, and yet still thinks the sermon is a really important part of the congregation's life.
And I think this is a really important point that we need to be thinking about in ministry circles, because frankly, there are some folks out there who say, just get rid of the sermon. We don't need it anymore.
So that all leads to the subject or the conversation we want to have today with Richard Cox about preaching and neuroscience, or the brain and sermons.
Hello and welcome to God21. I'm Jay Akkerman. I'm here with my colleague Tom Oord, and we're really excited today to have Dr. Richard H. Cox, author of Rewiring Your Preaching, on the line with us today. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Richard's book, published by InterVarsity Press, and especially interested in how it relates to life in the church, and especially how it relates to those of us who preach on a regular basis or from time to time, as the case may be. Dr. Cox has a long history and is really kind of a Renaissance man, I've discovered, Tom, as we've been getting ready for this podcast. He not only has an MD degree and a PhD in psychology, he teaches now as an adjunct at Duke University Medical School, but is also an ordained Presbyterian clergyman with a Master of Divinity and a Doctor of Ministry degree as well. So he is an accomplished physician, a professor, and he's also a speaker and a writer, as well as being an author, writing not only books like this one related to ministry, but also those related to psychology and even to music, I discovered as well. Is that correct, Richard?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm sitting here doing some arrangements for brass quintet right now.
Yeah,
and the reason I can't be with you, Nick, during the time you wished is that I am actually presenting at the International Trumpet Guild in Michigan.
It doesn't surprise me at all. As I read through this book, I've said to myself, only someone with a variety of interests and expertise could write this kind of a interdisciplinary kind of book. I've never read a preaching book that talks so much about brains.
Oh, my.
Well, Richard, I ran across your book actually several months ago. A friend of mine who is the editor of Grace and Peace magazine asked me if I had seen it. I teach preaching at Northwest Nazarene University, both at the undergraduate level and also at the graduate level too. And my friend ran across your book through InterVarsity and turned me onto it. I picked up a copy and was fascinated to read how you explore how the brain processes sermons. And I immediately after finishing it, I posted in Facebook a recommendation and had quite a few of my friends out there pick it up. And as I've even mentioned in Facebook recently that would be doing this podcast conversation, I've had a number of them express their jealousy that they're not able to join us today as well, because they found your book very helpful. Maybe to kind of get the conversation started, Richard, I'm curious, how has your understanding of the human brain influenced the way, first of all, that you preach?
Well, that's a very fair question, because I think a confession is in order. That is, I think I realized after preaching for many, many years that as much as I wanted to tell myself I was effective, bottom line is that I ask people, not only in pastorates and other places where I had preached, but also parishioners of other congregations, only a day or two after the Sunday sermon, what did your preacher preach about Sunday? And amazingly, time after time they say, that's interesting. I guess I don't remember.
I think almost any preacher can relate to that.
Well, I think that's right. And being a person who's supposed to be somewhat of an expert in brain function, I began to think, well, if that is true, then we need to have a better understanding of the brain. And how do we do things so that the brain does remember it? Because if the brain does not remember it, it obviously cannot translate it into meaning, and it cannot then translate the meaning into any kind of decision-making, and then forward it certainly will have no effect upon action and results. And then I also began to ask myself, why are decisions that are sometimes made at the following of a sermon only decisions that are momentary? Mm-hmm. How come those decisions don't last for a week or two? Now, many do. I think in many of our lives, our decisions we've made at the end of sermons have lasted a lifetime. But I certainly know in my life that many decisions made at the end of service didn't last until I got home. Right. So I began to ask, what is it about the brain that allows us to learn? And learning is really no different in theology than it is in any other subject. It's a matter of subject matter that is built upon previously accepted subject matter. And of course, that's where the word religion, religare in the Latin, where it comes from, is to tie back.
Yep.
To build upon that which we've already had. And so that led me to thinking about how we preach, why we preach, where we preach, and the importance of it, and opening the brain so that we can use more of our resources to make the word effective. So that's really what got me going on it. And then once I started writing, it began to unfold, and I found myself in my teaching at Duke talking with psychiatry residents particularly, but also neurology and other residents, as to how the brain operates. And for instance, why do patients not remember what you tell them and take the wrong medicine when they get home? Why do they not be more compliant and do what physicians want them? Well, because the brain is not integrating sufficiently, and so they are making what you might call temporary decisions, and those temporary decisions are not embedded in the brain adequately so that they can result in action.
That's really interesting, Richard. I loved a quote that you have in this book from St. Francis de Sales. The test of the worth of a preacher is when his, or I would add her congregation goes away saying, not what a beautiful sermon, but I will do something. And that is such an important step forward that we really need to think about, all of us who step into any pulpit. And it's one of the things I challenge, I know, my preaching students with too, is to really consider, what is the outcome that we really desire occurs as a result of this preaching? And I really like the way in this book you help in everyday terms preachers and pastors and lay people as well understand better what exactly is happening between our ears. So let me just toss that out. What is actually happening in our craniums when we experience a sermon?
Well, that's a fair question, and it's complicated, but let's see if we can make it simple. When vibrations hit the eardrum, it is not yet sound. It's only vibrations of air that hit the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, and then it goes into the inner ear where it still is not sound. It's still only vibrations of movement that hit against those three little bones in the inside of the ear. And then as it moves on through the inner ear, it becomes more of a combination electrical and chemical function. It still is not really thought. And those vibrations only become thought when they hit the inner brain and connect with other connections that have been previously accepted. In other words, what you've already believed, you can add to it. What you already know, you can add to it. This is why I point out in the book the incredible importance of dealing with children and of getting to young people while our brains are still malleable and still learnable. But then inside the brain, what happens is a whole series of chemical and electrical complexes that form what you might call branding in the brain, engramming, as Piaget called it. What it means is stamping something in the brain, and that stamping is on top of something that is already stamped there, and then the brain has to make some decisions. there are a number of things that can happen. You can decide that you aren't going to pay attention to it, and but you might need it someday. So the brain stores it back someplace, very much like a library. It catalogs it someplace where hopefully someday you'll be able to find it. Or it can decide this is nonsense and attempt to throw it out. Now, the brain has a tough time throwing out anything that it hears, but it can make it much less important. Or the brain can decide this is powerful and I need to act on it immediately. In which case, of course, then the fright and the flight and the fight comes in, and the brain says, do something and do it right this second. This is emergent. Or the brain can say this is important and I'm going to continue to ruminate on it and think about it. And those are the kinds of things that typically crop up then in later thinking when we're not on the subject at all. We're driving down the road and thinking about something else, and all of a sudden that pops in our mind. Or it pops into our mind in a dream at night because the brain is still mulling it over in there someplace. But then comes the important part, and that is that different parts of the brain we've learned have different actions. For instance, the amygdala seems to respond to stress by producing either anger or fright or flight. The highly emotive part of the brain, which tends to be more the right hemisphere, and the amygdala then decide whether or not it's going to be something that is put into some kind of immediate action. Then there are other parts of the brain that tend to cause more of a peaceful feeling, more of a tranquility. Then, of course, the left brain is the one that we think about as the one that tends to be more analytical. So the brain is sitting there while you're preaching, deciding, what am I going to do with these words that this man or woman are tossing out to me? And in that process, they are literally deciding what they're going to do with what you are saying.
Well, that's fascinating, Richard. And I gotta ask you. I can't resist this. Knowing what you know and describing what you've just described, what is it like to be in your head on a Sunday morning when you're listening to a sermon?
When you're listening to someone else preaching?
Exactly.
Well, fortunately, I don't think about it. I really don't. That's a fair question. I don't think I have ever actually, although I may have while I was writing this book. Apart from writing the book, I don't think I ever too much think about that. But it does cross my mind frequently in a sermon, listening to someone. I wonder if anyone really is paying any attention to this.
I think a lot of people think that, no matter if they think about neurology or not.
I think about that often when I'm in the middle of a sermon. So
I love it. I think
I look around me and I see people, picking their fingernails and twisting their hair and cleaning their glasses and tying their shoes, and and now these days looking at their cell phone and texting back and forth, and I think, how can the preacher cut through this? How can we reach the people down there who are here out of habit and possibly have no real, in the deepest sense of the word, spiritual reason for being here?
Yeah. When I was reading...
And that's what really drove me to write that book, is hoping that preachers could then open as many gates as possible so people can't escape it. So when you have a children's sermon, for instance, I think it is so powerful, and if you'll notice, adults pay far more attention to the children's sermon most of the time than they do the adult sermon. Mm-hmm. But it's because we're opening so many of the brain gates, so many of the ways into the brain. And of course, that's one of my biases, I'm sure you picked up in the book, is that one of my problems with modern, what we might call postmodern theology, which I don't like that term at all, but nonetheless, the day in which we live, is that we are more and more and more separating ourselves from the things that force us to think spiritually. And what I mean by that is, now I don't know where all Nazarene churches are today, but in our little Nazarene church in Decatur, it was, it was not like a Episcopal church or something. We didn't have the Stations of the Cross and all that kind of thing, although I'm not really opposed to those, though those again become gates into the brain. But, there was an altar, and there was a cross, and there was a pulpit, and there was a Bible on the communion table, and all the things that make it a different place, that calls the mind to a different kind of thinking. And then I visit a mega church in which I can't tell the difference between the church and a roller skating rink or any other big building. What is it that pulls me then into God in this empty room?
Well, what's interesting to me in that conversation, Richard, is that many of the things that you've just described, those connection points that I would want to argue can be helpful processes toward the kind of stamping or imprinting you mentioned a few minutes ago. Many of those things are not on the audio channel. But that's how we often think about preaching, as being just what goes in our ears. And so what you've described is a real challenge, regardless of whether you're a Presbyterian or a Nazarene or attend a non-denominational evangelical church out there. It's a real it's where our congregations live, and this is the challenge that preaching is facing today.
I think it's a tremendous challenge. And, of course, I do not go to a Roman Catholic church, nor am I Roman Catholic, obviously. But if you were to ask just the common layman on the street, if you saw someone standing and singing, then kneeling, then standing and reciting something, and then kneeling, and then standing, and then kneeling, and then going up and taking something to drink and a little piece of bread, what do you think they might be doing? Most people would say they've gone to a Catholic church. If you were to say, I saw some people and they went into a building and they sat down and they listened to a person talk, and then somebody, I think they prayed at the end and then they all left. Where do you think they were? Well, interesting. They might have been at a graduation ceremony, a funeral, a church, who knows? So the more that we can force the mind to know where it is and what it's doing, the more likely it is to make connections.
So it seems
things we want to connect to.
So it seems to me, I'm thinking about our listeners out there who are in, say, pastoral ministry. The environment that a local congregation cultivates is really essential. It seems to me is the case that you're making here.
It's critical
for helping parishioners act on what is being preached.
Exactly. For instance, in most mainline churches, I don't know of any mainline church today where they kneel to pray. Do they still kneel to pray in a Nazarene church?
Occasionally.
Occasionally. When I grew up as a kid, they never prayed without kneeling.
Interesting.
Now, I don't think God doesn't hear us any more on our knees than on our feet. But there is a symbolism involved in it, and I walk into a room, people see the ring on my finger, I don't have to announce that I'm married. If I'm kneeling, no one has to ask usually what I'm doing. So the point I'm making is the brain, I guess the thing I'm preaching and pleading for is to use every resource the brain has to imprint the message that we wanted to hear.
Yeah, I like that a lot. You know, I'm a theologian, and I also do a lot with science and religion. So some of the stuff that you talk about in terms of the brain was not new to me. I like the way, though, that you connect the recent emphasis upon the neuroplasticity of the brain, the idea that the brain is malleable and changeable. And that, when I went to your chapter, in which you specifically title, having to do with theology, you talk a lot about practices and liturgical practices as well as interpersonal practices like asking forgiveness by taking the Eucharist. And I think that's pretty important. For so often, for so long, I should say, I thought of the brain as kind of like a computer that basically everything stays the same. You just add or subtract information. But if the brain really is capable of changing, of being transformed by not only information but practices, that seems to say something important too about what it means to be a minister, a preacher, a person who wants to live and proclaim the gospel of Christ.
Well, we know that the brain that fires together wires together. Now, what that means in absolute terms is that if the brain continues to make certain connections, we know now that it actually can create new circuits within the brain.
Right, right.
And upon that, we build a great deal today, for instance, in post-stroke patients and rehabilitation of brain problems. And the same thing is true then in terms of learning. We used to think that when you got older, that we couldn't learn anymore. We actually then thought that when brain cells died, that they were dead forever. We know that's not true anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We know that we can continue to build new brain cells and new circuits as long as we're alive.
Well, and that gets me to another question for you that surprised me reading this book, quite frankly. A big chunk of this book is you talking about healing. And when I think about brains and I think about preaching, the first thing I think of is not healing. But you talk a lot about that. I'd like to hear more of how you came to believe that really a central part of being a preacher is being a healer or cooperating with God's healing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you asked that, because I think the first and tremendous grievous sin is the separation of God and his creation, that is us.
Mm-hmm.
And I see the reconciliation of that as a healing between us and our Maker.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that the very first illness is the illness that leads unto death, and that is the illness that causes us never to believe, and thus leads us into spiritual death. So healing all the way along, it seems to me, is the reconciliation, the redemption, if you will, all those R-E words, that bring us back into a healthy relationship, as over against a sick or neurotic or an ill relationship with God. And then, of course, secondarily to that, obviously, is to each other. And when you think of the fellowship of believers, and then I didn't put this in the book, but I'll mention to you as preachers, and if I were ever giving a series of talks to students, I would emphasize so much that one of the greatest problems in our church today is not only that people don't hear the gospel, but those of us who believe the gospel are constantly out of fellowship with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need the healing between brothers and sisters and us and the community and us and the world. And so I see healing as a major ministry even of Christ. Christ, why did he use healing to illustrate his work? You know, he might have been able to use something else to illustrate that he was the Son of God and that salvation is here. But he used constantly healing of the mind and of the body as a way to say this is the way to know that God is in the business of making people whole.
Yeah, I mean, that's just so different, I think, from the way many Christians think about being a Christian and being right with God. I think many Christians think of it in terms of, judicial kinds of images. There's the judge, there's a jury, you're on trial. Are you going to be found guilty or innocent? It's not so much about, am I going to be healed, transformed, That's
true.
That's what salvation is, in my view.
Right, and yet we do speak of Jesus as the great physician, do we not?
Right. Yeah. You mentioned a moment ago, Richard, a teaching series, and in the book you talk also about preachers using series as a means to help get their point across. I'm curious, how are sermon series particularly significant in your mind in terms of our brains?
Well, a good question also. I would answer that by asking, why is it that miniseries on TV keep people turning into it? The surprise element, the anticipation, the incompleteness of something for which a person wants to find completeness. And so, I've often I used to love to preach through the various books. And take the book of Romans or Galatians, and you're preaching on justification by faith. But you leave some of it hanging in the air so that they have to think about it and come back the next week to finish it off. Mm-hmm. And it's like any other continuing series that it intrigues the mind. In a sense, it's like the novel, that you just can't lay it down. You have to get to the end. And the brain works that way. The brain wants to find completion. And so whenever you leave something hanging, it's like playing, like if you were to do in music, you could very easily do...
Hey, a little music on this program.
We have to complete it, don't we?
And that's the whole idea.
Yeah.
The brain cannot let something hang that is incomplete. And so a series keeps people intrigued.
Well, my incomplete preaching, maybe there's a good case to be made. I'm doing better than I thought I was.
I guess one of the things, to be perfectly honest, is I think it's a little bit of a psychological tool. I wouldn't call it a trick, but I think it's a tool. It's just one more thing that pulls people into what we're trying to do.
Well, I see some parallels here too, Richard, look at the New Testament parables, for instance. Over and over again, Jesus uses parables to teach. And what's just kind of inherent in every parable is that they certainly can carry a message, but they also leave a conundrum along the way, They do. And so we're left hanging. What do we do with this, older brother who now has to deal with this younger brother who's come home, this prodigal who's returned home? But, Luke leaves us hanging in Luke 15. What do we do with this, of course? And that's the whole point and power of a parable, is it forces us now to wrestle with it.
Well, that is correct. And if you think in terms of public speaking and music both, I teach my students, in the summertime frequently at Interlochen up in Michigan, a great music camp. And one of the things I teach is one of the most important things in playing music are the rests. Not the notes, although they're important, but the rests. And in your preaching, what's some of the most powerful thing that you do? It's the pause between two particular points. And you're letting people hang in the air and wait to find what that next thing's going to be.
Nice. At the end of the book, I was intrigued by your use of the language of woo and woe. Woo being the preaching for reward, and woe is... I'd like to hear you talk more about the woo and woe of preaching.
Well, I think I can do that because that comes to me really from the Psalms and the Song of Solomon and things of that nature, and also from the most wonderful gospel song that we sing, Jesus, Lover of My Soul. The concept being that you can either scare people into the gospel, I suppose, which many, many preachers for centuries have done, or we can intrigue people and invite them in. And there's the woo of the gospel, the love of God, if you will, the great hymn, again, that we sing, the love of God. And so many of our hymns and so much of the Scripture has to do with God loved us so much that He gave His only begotten Son.
Yeah.
It isn't that God scares us so much, although there are certainly, I understand the theology of that as well. But the greater theology is that God has loved us and wooed us into His bosom in a way that nothing else can do.
I think that's powerful stuff. I mean, I think, in my mind, that really resonates. Although I do want to make a suggestion that in the second edition of this book, to woo, W-O-O, and to woe, W-O-E, you ought to add W-H-O-A. Whoa!
Well, you're complimentary to think that this book could ever hit us. But you're right, and I think the thing that I've really wanted to do is really not even stated in the book, and that is to try to integrate a number of disciplines to tell preachers to broaden their minds, to include, like I pointed out in the first part, that Wesley and Spurgeon and these have said to their students, hey, learn everything you can about everything, because if you're going to garden, you're going to need a lot of tools. If you're going to practice medicine, you need a lot of tools. If you're going to preach, you need a lot of tools. And so the thing I'm hoping is that people will open their minds to using every conceivable tool for the power of preaching.
Yeah, that's great. I just can't tell you how much we appreciate this today, Richard. My students who, I don't know if I mentioned it here in this podcast, but I've adopted your book for an undergraduate online course that I'm teaching here at Northwest Nazarene University right now. And my hope originally was that we could do a web chat with my students, which I often do in many of my courses. But given a number of scheduling challenges that you and I and Tom were facing, we decided to incorporate this into one of our God21 podcasts. And I'm going to take this conversation and make it available to my students there. And I'm quite confident that that this podcast will really resonate with quite a few of our listeners out there, not only preachers, but also those who listen to preaching week in and week out. We really are grateful, Richard, for you giving us some time today, and we're grateful for your connection to the Church of the Nazarene growing up, and also for your service in ministry, and also in helping men and women and children wrestle and come to grips with healing in their own minds and in their hearts as well. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to share in this conversation with Tom and with me today.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm more than glad to, and if I can ever be helped at the seminary out that way or at university, I would love to do so.
Well, that sounds great. Well, we've been sharing today in conversation with Dr. Richard Cox. He's the author of Rewiring Your Preaching, How the Brain Processes Sermons, published by InterVarsity Press. I commend this book to you, and we're grateful today for your listening to God21. Feel free to contact us at godcast21@gmail.com, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.